The Georgia dust, hot and red, swirled around hardened men who'd seen hell more times than they could count. They watched, leaning on their spades and rifles, as the enemy hauled a strange contraption into position. They smirked. Laughed even. Another Yankee folly, surely. But then, the laughter died. Not with a bang, but with a mechanical hum, relentless and alien. A sound that ripped through the air, unlike any cannon's roar or musket's crack. And the dust, now mingled with screams, rose higher, stained redder, as the impossible became horrifyingly real. This was the moment war changed forever. A pivotal clash between the brutal realities of industrial innovation and the ancient, bloody dance of battle. A single machine, designed with a perverse idealism, unleashed a storm of lead that would rewrite the rules of engagement and cast a long, dark shadow over the future of conflict. Where are you watching us from today? Let us know in the comments below. From Hidden Files, this is the story of the Gatling gun. The year 1861 did not merely herald the outbreak of civil war, it unleashed a maelstrom of violence that redefined human conflict. From the sun-drenched fields of Manassas to the blood-soaked banks of the Shiloh, the conflict quickly shed any romantic veneer, revealing itself as a brutal, grinding machine of death. The sprawling American landscape, once a tapestry of tranquil farms and burgeoning towns, transformed into an open-air abattoir. The air, once scented with freshly tilled earth and pine, now often carried the metallic tang of blood and the acrid sting of gunpowder. Generals on both sides, many of them seasoned veterans from the Mexican-American War, found themselves tragically outmatched by the very tools their industrializing nation had forged. Their training, rooted deeply in the Napoleonic traditions of grand strategy, massed formations, and decisive charges, proved woefully inadequate against the cold, hard realities of modern weaponry. They ordered their brigades to advance in tight, shoulder-to-shoulder lines, expecting to overwhelm the enemy through sheer momentum and disciplined bayonet work. But the enemy no longer waited patiently within the limited range of smoothbore muskets. A silent, yet profound, revolution had already taken root. The rifled musket, epitomized by the Union Springfield Model 1861 and the Confederates' imported Enfield Pattern 1853, had irrevocably altered the calculus of battle. These weapons, with their spiraled barrels, imparted a spin to the bullet, granting it vastly improved accuracy and a lethal range measured in hundreds of yards, not dozens. The killing zone expanded dramatically, transforming open ground into a deadly gauntlet. What was once a relatively safe distance for forming up now became a pre-slaughter pasture. Soldiers, whose grandfathers had fought in formations where the enemy could be seen, heard, even smelled before firing, now dropped dead from unseen marksmen lurking far beyond their own effective return fire. The consequences were horrific. At Fredericksburg, Union soldiers were cut down in swathes, their charges against the stone wall on Marye's Heights becoming little more than prolonged suicide missions. At Gettysburg, Pickett's charge, a desperate, valiant push across open fields, devolved into a bloodbath, illustrating in ghastly detail the futility of outdated tactics against entrenched, rifled fire. The psychological toll was immense. Men who had volunteered with patriotic fervor soon found their courage tested not just by the sight of death, but by its sheer, anonymous ubiquity, delivered by an unseen hand. The constant, gnawing fear of a bullet from nowhere, the sickening thud of lead striking flesh, became the pervasive soundtrack of existence in the trenches and on the skirmish lines. Yet, despite this horrifying increase in individual rifle power, a critical limitation persisted: the rate of fire. A skilled infantryman, even with the new, more potent rifles, could still only manage a painstaking 3 to 4 shots per minute. Each shot was a laborious ritual: tear the paper cartridge with teeth, pour powder into the barrel, ram the ball down, cap the nipple. This inherent slowness meant that while individual shots were deadlier, the overall volume of fire remained relatively low and intermittent, allowing enemy forces brief reprieves, moments to regroup or reload. The dream of every commanding officer, a silent, desperate prayer whispered into the smoke-choked air, was to multiply this raw firepower, to unleash a sustained, overwhelming torrent of lead that would shatter enemy formations and suppress their resistance, all without the catastrophic human cost of massed frontal assaults. Hundreds of miles from the front line's agony, in the bustling, yet comparatively serene, city of Indianapolis, Dr. Richard Jordan Gatling observed the unfolding tragedy with a unique blend of scientific detachment and profound human empathy. A man of 43 in 1861, Gatling was not a soldier, nor had he ever directly experienced the visceral terror of battle. His life up to that point had been dedicated to progress, to invention that eased human toil. His mind, sharp and analytical, had already yielded patents for innovative agricultural machinery, including a seed planter and a steam plow, designed to increase efficiency and productivity. He was a creator, a problem solver, driven by a quiet ambition to improve the material conditions of life. But the war had cast a long, grim shadow over his peaceful endeavors. Each morning, as he unfolded the latest newspaper, the casualty lists grew longer, a grim litany of names and regiments. He saw not just numbers, but the crushing weight of disease, the rampant infections from crude surgical practices, the sheer exhaustion that claimed more lives than bullets. His medical background, his understanding of physiology and public health, made him acutely aware that battle wounds were only one facet of the war's merciless attrition. Dysentery, typhoid, pneumonia, these silent killers swept through encampments, decimating regiments with an efficiency that rivaled the deadliest artillery barrage. It was amidst this contemplation of widespread suffering, a daily immersion in the statistics of death, that Gatling experienced his profound, almost perverse, epiphany. His logical mind, always seeking efficiency, saw the problem from a unique angle. If war was an inevitable, brutal reality, then perhaps the most direct path to mitigating its human cost was through radical technological advancement in the act of killing itself. He reasoned that if a single machine could deliver the firepower of 100, even 200 men, then the necessity for vast armies would diminish. Fewer men would be mustered, fewer would be marched off to die from disease, fewer would face the agonizing lottery of a battlefield wound. The ultimate paradox, to save lives by making the act of killing more efficient. His invention, he believed with an almost innocent sincerity, would be an instrument of peace, not through its gentleness, but through its sheer, terrifying capability. The challenge was immense. To transform this abstract concept into a tangible machine required a complete rethinking of firearm design. Gatling envisioned a continuous cycle, a relentless pouring forth of projectiles that bypassed the slow, human-driven reload. He sketched endlessly, his workshop filled with the quiet hum of intense concentration. By 1862, his efforts culminated in a revolutionary patent. The core of his design was a cluster of 6 steel barrels, arranged concentrically around a central shaft. Each barrel, in essence, was an individual firearm, complete with its own firing pin and extractor. But their genius lay in their unified, synchronized rotation. A simple hand crank, turned by a single operator, set the entire assembly in motion. As the cluster of barrels spun, each one would pass through a precise sequence of operations. A paper cartridge, held within a brass chamber, would be fed by gravity from a drum-shaped hopper mounted above. The barrel would rotate into position, align with the firing mechanism, and discharge its projectile. Then, as it continued its rotation, the spent casing would be extracted and ejected. This continuous, sequential process allowed for an unprecedented rate of fire. While one barrel was discharging, others were simultaneously loading, extracting, and cooling. The theoretical rate of fire was nothing short of astonishing for the era, 200 rounds per minute. This was not the ragged, stuttering roar of a musket volley, but a sustained, mechanical shriek of destruction. To a soldier accustomed to the slow, deliberate pace of muzzle-loading firearms, such a continuous hail of lead would be utterly alien, terrifying in its relentless artificiality. Gatling's invention promised to multiply the individual rifleman's output by a staggering 50 times, transforming the battlefield from a contest of individual bravery and sporadic volleys into a zone dominated by a relentless, impersonal storm of iron. It was a stark, mechanical declaration that the era of human-centric warfare, with its reliance on individual skill and courage, was rapidly yielding to the cold, brutal efficiency of the machine. The stage was set for a new kind of war, born not of human intent, but of industrial might. Dr. Richard Jordan Gatling's revolutionary design, patented in the spring of 1862, hummed with theoretical promise on paper. It was an elegant solution, a marvel of interlocking gears and rotating barrels, poised to redefine the very act of warfare. Yet, the chasm between innovative blueprint and battlefield reality was often vast and treacherous, especially in the crucible of the American Civil War. When the first prototypes of the Gatling gun were assembled and put to the test, the initial results were less a roar of triumph and more a frustrating sputter. The vision of a continuous, devastating hail of bullets faltered against the crude realities of mid-19th century ammunition. The paper cartridges of the era, though standard for rifled muskets, were notoriously fragile and susceptible to the elements. During early demonstrations on dusty proving grounds or in humid workshops, the delicate paper would often absorb moisture, swelling infinitesimally, but enough to cause catastrophic malfunctions within the precise tolerances of Gatling's mechanism. Cartridges jammed in the feed mechanism, refusing to drop into their chambers. Or, worse, they'd lodge halfway, twisting and crumpling, bringing the entire rotation to an abrupt, metallic halt. The rhythmic thump-thump-thump of the crank, meant to usher in a new age of firepower, would instead become a grating clunk as the gears locked up, followed by the cursing of frustrated operators and the urgent, fiddly work of clearing a jammed chamber with specialized tools. Even when the cartridges fed reliably, another insidious enemy emerged: black powder residue. The standard propellant of the time, black powder, burned notoriously dirty, leaving behind a thick, corrosive fouling of carbon and potassium sulfide. After only a few dozen shots, this gritty residue would begin to coat the intricate moving parts, the firing pins, the extractors, the very surfaces of the barrels. What was designed to be a smooth, continuous cycle quickly became a sticky, grinding struggle. The hand crank, initially easy to turn, would become stiff, demanding increasing force from the operator until it, too, seized up. The elegant mechanism choked on its own exhaust, a victim of the very material that fueled its destructive potential. The promise of 200 rounds per minute often degraded into a frantic, smoke-choked attempt to coax 50 rounds out before the weapon inevitably jammed or seized completely, requiring a laborious disassembly and cleaning. These were not the glorious, world-changing demonstrations Gatling had envisioned, but rather disheartening exhibitions of mechanical frailty. More formidable than any mechanical flaw, however, was the impenetrable wall of institutional skepticism. The Union Army, a vast and often cumbersome bureaucracy, was notoriously resistant to change, particularly when that change originated from an outsider, a civilian inventor with no military pedigree. At the heart of this resistance stood Brigadier General James Wolfe Ripley, a figure as entrenched in tradition as the fortresses he designed. At 70 years old in 1864, Ripley was the formidable chief of the Ordnance Department, a man whose career spanned decades, whose experience dated back to the War of 1812 and prominently included the Mexican-American War. His world was one of smoothbore cannons and flintlock muskets, of disciplined ranks firing in volleys, a world that moved at the deliberate pace of marching boots and sailing ships. Ripley's office in Washington, D.C. was a testament to his unyielding conservatism. Heavy oak furniture, leather-bound ledgers, and maps that seemed to depict a bygone era filled the space. The air hung thick with the scent of old paper and the quiet hum of an institution designed for endurance, not innovation. For Ripley, the very notion of a machine gun was an absurd, even dangerous, departure from established military practice. He viewed such gadgets as a waste of precious resources, a distraction from the tried and true methods that had, in his estimation, always won wars. He saw not efficiency, but complexity, not power, but needless expense and unreliability. He famously dismissed repeating rifles, arguing they would cause soldiers to waste ammunition. Grenades, another battlefield innovation that promised to break stalemates, were likewise relegated to the scrap heap of his scorn. When Dr. Gatling, a deferential but persistent figure, arrived at Ripley's office with models and earnest explanations, he was met with a gaze that was both weary and dismissive. Ripley, a man whose posture seemed to embody the rigidity of military doctrine, would listen with a polite but utterly unconvinced expression. The general would often interrupt with curt questions about logistics, about the cost, about the propriety of such a device on a battlefield where bravery and discipline, not mechanical contrivances, were paramount. He viewed Gatling's paradoxical argument, that a more efficient killing machine would save lives, as a naive and impractical fantasy from a man who had never smelled gunpowder in anger. The official reports that emerged from the Ordnance Department regarding the Gatling gun were consistently negative, citing its complexity, its cost, its perceived unreliability, and above all, its lack of proven utility in actual combat. Consequently, despite its revolutionary potential, the Gatling gun remained officially unadopted by the Union Army for the vast majority of the war. It was relegated to the fringes, an interesting curiosity rather than a strategic asset. The Army's coffers, already strained by the immense cost of maintaining the largest fighting force in American history, were not to be wasted on what Ripley deemed an untested indulgence. This bureaucratic paralysis meant that any general or unit commander who saw the potential in Gatling's invention had to bypass official channels, often purchasing the weapons themselves or relying on personal funds or unit discretionary budgets, a testament to both their foresight and their frustration with the glacial pace of military procurement. One such visionary, a man whose pragmatism cut through bureaucratic red tape like a hot knife through butter, was General Benjamin Franklin Butler. At 46 years old in 1864, Butler was a Union commander of significant, if controversial, renown. A lawyer and politician before the war, he lacked the traditional military academy background of many of his peers, which perhaps made him less beholden to rigid military conventions. He was known for his decisive, often audacious, actions, and an acute understanding of the logistical and technological demands of modern warfare. Serving as the commander of the Department of Virginia and North Carolina, Butler found himself locked in the brutal, attritional struggle around Petersburg, a grinding siege that screamed for a radical shift in firepower. Unlike Ripley, Butler possessed a keen, almost mercantile, eye for potential. He saw past the initial mechanical kinks and the bureaucratic disdain, recognizing the fundamental principle behind Gatling's design. He understood that in a war of attrition, where every inch of ground was contested at horrific cost, any machine that could amplify a soldier's lethality was not a frivolous expense, but a strategic necessity. He had likely witnessed firsthand the devastating effectiveness of rifled fire from fixed positions and understood that a defensive weapon capable of sustaining a hurricane of lead could be a game-changer. Against the explicit, unspoken disapproval of the Ordnance Department, and with a conviction that bordered on defiance, General Butler made a fateful decision. In the spring of 1864, he personally acquired a dozen Model 1862 Gatling guns. Each weapon cost approximately $1,000, a staggering sum in an era when an average private earned a mere $13 a month. Butler's purchase represented a considerable personal fortune, equivalent to the annual salaries of 20 soldiers, or over 3 years of his own general's pay. It was a gamble, an act of faith in a machine that many dismissed as a folly, a testament to his willingness to invest not just his authority, but his own financial resources, into a technology he believed could break the stalemates of trench warfare. The acquisition was quiet, a series of transactions facilitated away from the scrutiny of Ripley's office. The 12 Gatlings, heavy and unwieldy, were shipped to Butler's command, ready to be deployed. They arrived not as official army material, but as a personal initiative, an unconventional answer to an increasingly desperate strategic problem. Unbeknownst to the conservative generals in Washington, and certainly to the Confederate soldiers who would soon face them, these privately purchased machines, symbols of a doctor's paradoxical dream and a general's audacious pragmatism, were about to be unleashed. The stage was now set for the Gatling gun to prove its lethal value, not in the sanitized environment of a proving ground, but in the bloody, unforgiving crucible of combat, where the cries of dying men would become its ultimate testament. The suffocating July of 1864 bled into August, painting the Georgian landscape in hues of dust and despair. The air hung thick, not just with the oppressive humidity, but with the perpetual scent of gunpowder, spent lead, and the faint, sickly sweet aroma of unburied mortality. Beneath a relentless sun, the land around Petersburg, Virginia, had become an open wound, a sprawling labyrinth of trenches, earthworks, and fortifications that stretched for 53 agonizing miles. Here, in this scarred, cratered earth, two vast armies, numbering over 125,000 Union soldiers against some 50,000 Confederates, clawed at each other in a brutal stalemate. This was not the war of grand charges and decisive battles envisioned by military theorists. This was a grinding, static hell, a grim precursor to the horrors that would define the Western Front 5 decades later. For General Ulysses S. Grant, the grim-faced commander-general of the Union armies, then 42, Petersburg was the indispensable choke point. Just 23 miles south of the Confederate capital of Richmond, it was a vital railway hub, the beating heart of the Confederacy's supply lines. His strategy was simple, if brutal, to strangle the rebellion by severing its arteries, to break the South's will through relentless, overwhelming pressure. Grant understood that this was no longer a war of maneuver but of attrition, a test of endurance and resources. Every yard gained, every position seized, came at an astronomical cost in blood and shattered bodies. Opposing him, from behind an intricate network of earthworks that seemed to defy natural geography, was General Robert E. Lee, a man of 57, whose weathered face bore the heavy weight of command. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, though outnumbered and increasingly starved of resources, remained a formidable fighting force, forged in the fires of Antietam, Chancellorsville, and Gettysburg. These were veterans, hardened by years of unimaginable carnage, men who had faced down artillery barrages that lasted for hours, who had held their ground against overwhelming charges, whose courage had become as unyielding as the very earth they now dug into. Their morale was sustained by fierce loyalty and a grim determination to defend their homeland. They knew the trenches like the back of their hands, every angle, every firing step, every hidden sniper's nest. They believed their defenses were impregnable, their resolve unbreakable. It was into this crucible of weary endurance and hardened defiance that General Benjamin Franklin Butler, at 46, prepared to introduce his audacious gamble. His 12 privately purchased Gatling guns, delivered covertly, were poised for their combat debut. On the morning of August 1, 1864, as the sun began its relentless climb, painting the dusty sky a hazy yellow, detachments of Union engineers and artillerymen began positioning the strange, multi-barreled contraptions. The chosen objective was a strongly defended Confederate salient, a projecting spur of earthworks that had resisted numerous Union assaults, each one dying in a hail of lead and fury. From their entrenched positions across the no-man's land, Confederate pickets and frontline soldiers watched the activity with a mixture of professional vigilance and profound amusement. They saw the lumbering wagons, the strange, squat profiles of the weapons being carefully unlimbered. To their eyes, accustomed to the familiar lines of cannon and the sleek forms of rifled muskets, these multi-barreled machines looked less like instruments of war and more like elaborate agricultural equipment, or worse, some monstrous, impractical toy. Whispers ran down the line, seasoned with a gallows humor born of years of combat. "Look at those Yanks," a grizzled Georgian sergeant chuckled, spitting tobacco juice onto the dusty parapet. "Always coming up with some new contraption. Another one of their useless inventions, bound to jam before it fires a dozen rounds." His comrades, hardened by 3 years of unprecedented carnage, nodded and laughed, pointing fingers at the curious sight. They had seen all manner of innovations fail spectacularly under the brutal conditions of real combat, bizarre hand grenades that exploded prematurely, clumsy rocket batteries that fired wildly, even the recent, disastrous Union mine assault at the crater, which had ended in a slaughter. This new Yankee inventiveness seemed just another caprice from some urban inventor who had never smelled burned powder or heard the agonizing cries of dying men. Their scorn was palpable, a shield against the endless dread of the siege. The Union infantry, forming up for the assault behind their own lines, looked toward the strange weapons with a similar, if less derisive, curiosity. They had been told of the new volley guns, machines that would clear the way, but they remained skeptical. Their own experiences had taught them that advancements came slowly, painfully, and often at their own expense. Yet, there was a faint, almost desperate hope, a yearning for anything that might make the next charge less suicidal, less costly. Then, the order came. A series of bugle calls echoed across the field, thin against the rising tension. Union lines stirred, bayonets glinting in the morning sun. A sudden, tense silence fell over the Confederate trenches as they braced themselves for the inevitable surge. But it was not the expected artillery barrage that preceded the attack, nor the ragged, sporadic fire of skirmishers. Instead, a new sound began to rise from the Union lines. Not the deep, concussive boom of a cannon, nor the sharp, distinct crack of a musket volley, but something utterly alien to the 19th century battlefield. It started as a low, mechanical whir, like 1,000 angry wasps. Then, as the operators, grim-faced and focused, began to crank the handles, the whir deepened, intensified, becoming a continuous, guttural growl. It was an industrial roar, the sound of gears meshing, of mechanisms engaging, of an engine of death awakening. It was the sound of a textile factory, transformed and weaponized, unleashed upon the battlefield. Thump 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 thump, the cranks revolved, and the 6 barrels of each Gatling gun began their dizzying, relentless spin. Then, the lead began to fly. It was not a scattering of bullets, not a volley, but a tempest. A continuous, unbroken sheet of .58 caliber projectiles tore through the air, shrieking towards the Confederate lines. The density of fire defied comprehension. Wooden palisades exploded into splinters. Sandbags, painstakingly stacked, erupted in gouts of dust and flying earth. Ricocheting rounds whined off rocks and metal, creating a deadly, unpredictable symphony of destruction. Men who had survived Antietam, Chancellorsville, and Gettysburg, who had stood firm under hours of relentless artillery, felt an ice-cold dread seize their hearts. This was different. This was not the fire of men, with its inevitable pauses for reload, its human fallibility. This was machine fire, relentless, unyielding, and utterly impersonal. The laughter died in their throats, replaced by gasps of shock, then screams of pure, unadulterated panic. A wave of terror, cold and absolute, washed over the Confederate lines. Commanders shouted orders, but their voices were drowned out by the mechanical roar and the terrifying impact of hundreds of bullets per minute. Soldiers, their faces contorted in horror, broke. They dropped their rifles, scrambling backward, desperately seeking cover that no longer seemed to exist. The psychological impact was profound. The difference between facing 100 muskets firing sporadically and a single weapon spewing 200 rounds a minute was the difference between a predictable storm and a supernatural, unstoppable phenomenon. Confederate after-action reports, usually couched in the stiff, formal language of military documentation, still managed to convey the unprecedented horror. One section grimly described how the incessant fire of the enemy's mechanized weapon had caused noticeable panic even among our most reliable troops. Another mentioned a demoralization that could not be checked by the efforts of our officers, a damning indictment of a weapon capable of shattering the courage of even the most hardened veterans. As the Confederate defense crumbled under this terrifying, unforeseen barrage, the Union infantry advanced. They moved forward with a newfound, astonished confidence, their eyes wide at the sight of the chaos the Gatlings were wreaking. The expected storm of return fire never materialized, or if it did, it was sporadic, uncoordinated, and utterly ineffectual. The salient, a position that had been drenched in Union blood in previous attempts, was captured with surprisingly light casualties. The tactical objective had been achieved, not through overwhelming numbers or heroic sacrifice, but through a terrifying, efficient application of concentrated firepower. In the choking dust and the lingering acrid smell of black powder, a new era of warfare had been born. It was not a dramatic bang, but a sustained, mechanical hum, the unforgiving whisper of a machine that supplanted man in the grim business of organized destruction. The age of individual heroism was being challenged, yielding to the cold, impersonal logic of industrial might, a shift that would forever alter the face of conflict. The mechanical roar of the Gatling guns at Petersburg echoed far beyond the contested salient, a grim harbinger of a new age. The psychological impact on the Confederate troops had been profound, shattering the morale of even the most hardened veterans. The Union attack, supported by this unprecedented volume of fire, had succeeded with startlingly few casualties. For a brief, intoxicating moment, it seemed that Dr. Gatling's dream of an efficient, war-shortening machine had proven its terrible potential. Yet, the path from battlefield triumph to widespread military adoption was rarely straightforward, especially when confronting the inertia of deeply ingrained tradition. The initial reports filtering back to Washington were met with a mixture of cautious interest and persistent skepticism. General Butler, naturally, championed the weapons, submitting detailed accounts of their devastating effectiveness. But the victory at Petersburg, however decisive in its localized impact, was still just one skirmish in a vast, sprawling war. Brigadier General James Wolfe Ripley, though now aged 70 and nearing the end of his tenure, continued to loom large as a spectral presence within the Ordnance Department. His decades of stubborn resistance to innovation had set a deeply conservative precedent, and the bureaucracy he had shaped moved at a snail's pace. The reports from the field were assessed, debated, and ultimately filed away, becoming mere footnotes in the vast, bloody ledger of the war. The war dragged on for another 8 agonizing months after Petersburg, finally concluding in April 1865. It wasn't until 1866, a full year after the cessation of hostilities, that the United States Army officially adopted the Gatling gun. Even then, the adoption was hesitant, limited in scope, and driven more by a belated recognition of its potential than by any wholesale embrace of a new tactical philosophy. The initial orders were modest, almost experimental, reflecting the lingering caution within the military establishment. They bought a few dozen, not the hundreds or thousands that would truly change the face of their future conflicts. However, Dr. Gatling had not rested on his laurels. He had diligently worked to refine his invention, learning from the very mechanical flaws that had plagued the early prototypes. The Model 1866 Gatling gun, the version finally adopted by the U.S. Army, represented significant advancements. The most crucial improvement was the shift from fragile paper cartridges to the robust, self-contained metallic cartridges. These brass casings, impervious to humidity, eliminated the jamming issues caused by swelling paper. They also provided a more consistent seal, preventing gas leakage and reducing the pervasive black powder fouling that had choked earlier models. This seemingly minor metallurgical change dramatically enhanced the weapon's reliability, transforming it from a temperamental marvel into a dependable instrument of sustained fire. Furthermore, internal mechanisms were strengthened, tolerances tightened, and the feeding system refined, all contributing to a more robust and resilient machine. Later versions, leveraging these improvements, would boast theoretical rates of fire approaching 400 rounds per minute, doubling the original's already impressive output. Yet, mechanical perfection could not overcome institutional inertia. The fundamental problem remained: the military, particularly its senior leadership, was trained for a different kind of war. Their minds, shaped by decades of traditional combat, struggled to integrate a weapon that demanded entirely new tactical doctrines. Where would it fit in the established formations of infantry and cavalry? How would it be resupplied with its ravenous appetite for ammunition? These were not just logistical questions, but philosophical ones. The Gatling gun wasn't just a bigger, faster rifle, it was a paradigm shift. It required new ways of thinking about concentrated firepower, about suppressing enemy positions, about the very geometry of the battlefield. But the generals, whose careers had been built on understanding and manipulating the movements of thousands of individual men, found it difficult to grasp the implications of a single machine that could do the work of 100. This resistance would have dire consequences. As the focus of American military operations shifted from the grand battlefields of the Civil War to the vast, untamed expanses of the Great Plains, the Gatling gun's potential was again overlooked, sometimes tragically so. The Indian Wars of the post-Civil War era demanded rapid movement, agile cavalry charges, and the ability to traverse rugged terrain. The Gatling, even in its improved form, was a heavy, cumbersome piece of equipment, often mounted on a field carriage, requiring horses or mules to pull it. Its weight was seen as a liability, an impediment to the swift pursuit and engagement of highly mobile Native American warriors. One officer, whose name would become tragically synonymous with this tactical blind spot, was Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. A flamboyant and ambitious cavalry officer, Custer, then 36 years old in 1876, embodied the very spirit of traditional cavalry warfare, daring charges, personal valor, and swift, decisive action. In the summer of that year, as his 7th U.S. Cavalry prepared for what he believed would be a decisive engagement against a large encampment of Sioux and Cheyenne warriors, Custer was offered the support of a battery of Gatling guns. He flatly refused. His reasoning, though tragically flawed in hindsight, was entirely consistent with the prevailing military mindset. He viewed the Gatlings as impedimenta, excess baggage. He argued that their weight would slow his fast-moving cavalry column, making it impossible to keep pace with the nimble warriors he intended to pursue. Furthermore, Custer held a deep, almost romantic, belief in the superiority of his cavalry and the personal courage of his troopers. He saw the Gatlings as an unnecessary crutch, perhaps even a sign of weakness, for an army that prided itself on close-quarters fighting and individual marksmanship. The image of the cavalry charge, sabers flashing and guidons streaming, was far more appealing to his sensibilities than the unheroic, mechanical grind of the machine gun. His fateful decision to leave the Gatlings behind at the Powder River Depot, dismissing them as too slow and cumbersome for his lightning campaign, would seal the doom of his command at the Battle of Little Bighorn in June 1876, when his vastly outnumbered troops faced thousands of warriors without the concentrated firepower that might have turned the tide. Ironically, while the United States Army wrestled with its internal conservatism, other global powers were beginning to recognize and adapt to the revolutionary potential of Gatling's invention with far greater speed and foresight. Across the Atlantic, the British Royal Navy, ever attuned to technological advantage, adopted Gatling guns in 1874. They positioned them on their warships, not necessarily for ship-to-ship combat, but to repel swarm attacks by small, fast gunboats or to suppress shore defenses during amphibious landings. The idea of a rapidly firing, sustained weapon for naval defense made immediate, practical sense to a maritime power. The great European powers, locked in a continuous arms race and driven by imperial ambitions, also began to take notice. The French, intrigued by the concept of sustained firepower, developed their own multi-barreled weapon, the mitrailleuse, though their design was fired by volley rather than continuous rotation, a crucial difference. The Germans, ever methodical, began experimenting with their own rotating designs, recognizing the strategic implications of such a weapon. These nations, less encumbered by the specific traditions of the American Civil War, were quicker to grasp that the Gatling gun represented not just an incremental improvement, but a fundamental shift in the very fabric of warfare. They saw in its mechanical roar the potential to project overwhelming force, to control vast territories, and to dominate indigenous populations with unprecedented efficiency. The stage was set for the Gatling to play a far more devastating role, not in the defensive trenches of Virginia, but on the far-flung battlefields of colonial expansion, where its true, terrible power would be unleashed on an unsuspecting world. The tragic blunder of Lieutenant Colonel Custer at Little Bighorn, a stark testament to the U.S. Army's lingering attachment to antiquated doctrines, stood in stark contrast to the burgeoning global recognition of the Gatling gun's potential. While American officers debated the merits of cavalry charges and the burdens of heavy equipment, European powers, driven by the relentless engines of industrial expansion and colonial ambition, wasted little time in grasping the transformative power of concentrated fire. The Gatling, refined and increasingly reliable, would soon reveal its truly devastating capabilities not in the contested trenches of the American Civil War, but in the distant, sun-baked landscapes of Africa and Asia, fundamentally altering the very mathematics of warfare and enabling tiny forces to dominate vast continental empires. The decades of the 1880s and 1890s marked the zenith of European colonialism, a period defined by the ruthless acquisition of territory and resources across the globe. Against indigenous populations, often armed with spears, bows, or antiquated muskets, the technological disparity was immense. And at the forefront of this disparity, delivering death with terrifying efficiency, were the early machine guns, directly descended from Gatling's rotational principle. They were instruments of subjugation, cold steel arbiters of imperial will. Consider the Battle of Ulundi in 1879, a pivotal engagement during the Anglo-Zulu War. A British force, numbering just over 5,300 soldiers, found themselves arrayed in a defensive square formation on the plains of Zululand, facing an impi of approximately 15,000 Zulu warriors. These were formidable fighters, renowned for their courage, discipline, and ferocious close-quarters combat. Their traditional tactics, involving sweeping, horn formations designed to encircle and overwhelm, had brought them numerous victories against smaller, less prepared British units. But at Ulundi, the British square was not just armed with Martini-Henry rifles, it was buttressed by artillery and, crucially, by 2 Gatling guns. As the Zulu impi advanced, a majestic and terrifying sight, their war cries echoing across the open veldt, the British held their fire. Then, the 2 Gatlings began to hum. Not the stuttering, unreliable early models of Petersburg, but improved, robust machines, spewing their metallic cartridges with a chilling, sustained roar. The continuous storm of lead tore into the dense Zulu ranks, cutting swaths through their formations. Men fell by the dozens, then by the hundreds, their charges broken not by fear, but by the sheer, physical impossibility of advancing through such an inferno. The battle, which might once have been a bloody, desperate struggle for survival, became a massacre. The British suffered a mere 15 dead, while between 1,500 and 3,000 Zulu warriors lay slain on the field, their courage shattered by a technology they could neither comprehend nor counter. The Gatling had transformed a potential tactical dilemma into a devastating display of technological supremacy. The same terrifying dynamic played out with even greater brutality in the deserts of the Sudan. In 1898, during the Battle of Omdurman, a combined Anglo-Egyptian force, heavily equipped with modern artillery and, crucially, the latest evolution of the machine gun, the Maxim gun, a fully automatic, recoil-operated weapon, confronted the dervish army of the Khalifa Abdallahi. Though the Maxim operated on a different principle than Gatling's hand-cranked mechanism, it perfected the concept of sustained, rapid fire, a direct descendant of the foundational idea. Approximately 25,000 dervish warriors, driven by religious fervor and armed primarily with spears and ancient firearms, charged across open ground towards the Anglo-Egyptian lines. The outcome was a slaughter of almost unimaginable proportions. The Maxim guns, often water-cooled to prevent overheating, poured forth a continuous, unwavering stream of bullets at rates exceeding 600 rounds per minute. The British and Egyptian soldiers, well-trained and well-positioned, watched as the dervish ranks simply melted away under the deluge. The battle was less a fight and more an execution. In a matter of hours, approximately 10,000 dervish warriors were killed, with countless more wounded. The Anglo-Egyptian forces, in stark contrast, suffered a mere 47 dead. Winston Churchill, then a young cavalry officer present at Omdurman, later wrote of the Maxim gun's terrible efficiency, noting that it tore and smashed the charging masses of the dervishes with horrible accuracy. These statistics were so grotesquely disproportionate that they seemed like fiction, yet they were chillingly real. The machine gun had not only multiplied firepower, it had fundamentally rewritten the mathematics of war, enabling small, technologically advanced forces to control vast territories and decisively crush resistance with minimal casualties to themselves. The world was changing, rushing headlong into the 20th century, carrying the lessons of industrialized death with it. The principle that Dr. Gatling had conceived, concentrated, sustained firepower, was becoming the defining characteristic of modern conflict. The Maxim gun, and its variants from other nations, perfected the concept, but the seed had been planted by the good doctor from Indiana. When the First World War erupted in 1914, it finally forced the military powers of the world to confront the full, horrifying implications of the weapon the Confederates had once laughed at in 1864. The Western Front, a sprawling scar across Europe, quickly devolved into a static nightmare of trench warfare. Here, the machine gun, particularly the recoil-operated, water-cooled models capable of spitting out 600 rounds per minute, found its ultimate, most destructive expression. Entrenched in depth, protected by barbed wire and concrete bunkers, these weapons created impenetrable zones of death. Infantry charges, once the cornerstone of offensive tactics, became suicidal acts of futility. Waves of men, ordered over the top, marched directly into concentrated fire, falling by the thousands in mere minutes. The Battle of the Somme in 1916 stands as a grim monument to this new reality. On the first day alone, German machine guns killed nearly 20,000 British soldiers, most in the opening hours of the attack as they advanced across no man's land. The paradox of Gatling had come full circle, but in the most twisted, horrifying way imaginable. His machine, designed to reduce the size of armies and save lives through efficiency, had instead exponentially increased their capacity to kill, forcing even larger mass mobilizations to compensate for the industrialized rates of attrition. The conflict swallowed millions, a testament to the machine's relentless appetite for human flesh. Yet, the legacy of Gatling's rotating design did not end with the trenches of World War I. For a time, it was eclipsed by the simpler, lighter, and more adaptable recoil-operated machine guns. But the fundamental ingenuity of rotating barrels, allowing for incredible rates of fire while managing heat and wear, was too profound to be permanently abandoned. In the 1960s, amidst the Cold War and the escalating conflict in Vietnam, the principle was dramatically resurrected. The M134 minigun emerged, an electrically powered, six-barreled behemoth capable of firing an astonishing 6,000 rounds per minute. Mounted on helicopters and ground vehicles, it delivered a terrifying, sustained wall of lead, earning its nickname from the sheer volume of fire it could unleash. Today, the direct descendants of Gatling's original concept continue to define modern warfare. The 20mm M61 Vulcan rotary cannon defends military aircraft from aerial threats, a terrifying guardian against high-speed projectiles. The Phalanx close-in weapon system, a ship-mounted Gatling-style gun, forms the last line of defense for naval vessels against incoming anti-ship missiles, spitting out thousands of rounds a minute in a desperate, last-ditch effort to intercept the threat. These are sophisticated, high-tech marvels, a far cry from the hand-cranked, black powder weapon of 1862, but their core principle, the rapid, continuous rotation of multiple barrels to achieve an impossible rate of fire, is unmistakably Gatling's. Dr. Richard Jordan Gatling, the Indiana physician, had conceived his invention in the hope of saving lives through the chilling logic of battlefield efficiency. He believed that if war could be made so terrible, so efficient in its destruction, then fewer men would be needed, fewer would suffer. Instead, his machine became a symbol, not of peace, but of the industrialization of death itself, a stark and permanent reminder of how technological innovation often escapes the moral intentions of its creators, carving its own inexorable path through history. In that suffocating Georgia dust of Petersburg, when Confederate laughter transformed into screams of terror under the mechanical, implacable rain of lead from those rotating barrels, modern warfare was truly born. And with it, the unsettling truth that the machine, in its cold, precise efficiency, had finally, definitively, supplanted man in the organized business of destruction. The mechanical hum that first silenced laughter and then ignited terror in the dust of Petersburg ultimately echoed across continents and through generations. From the colonial battlefields where vastly outnumbered forces carved out empires, to the desolate, blood-soaked trenches of the Great War, the Gatling gun, and its relentless descendants, etched an undeniable truth into the annals of human conflict. The age of personalized combat was yielding to the cold, impersonal efficiency of the machine. The physician's paradoxical dream of saving lives through superior killing power had, in a tragic twist of fate, amplified the very scale of death, transforming warfare into an industrial enterprise. Today, the spirit of Gatling's ingenious rotation lives on, not in the quaint hand-cranked contraptions of old, but in the blistering, electronically driven fury of the minigun, in the defensive ballet of Vulcan cannons, and the last-ditch defiance of the Phalanx system. It is a persistent whisper through the corridors of military innovation, a stark reminder that technology, once unleashed, rarely respects the moral compass of its creators. It grows, adapts, and evolves, often far beyond the initial, well-intentioned vision, shaping futures no single mind could ever fully foresee. The machine, designed to make conflict finite, instead made it infinite in its capacity for destruction, perpetually pushing the boundaries of what humanity is willing to wield in the name of victory. What do you believe is the true cost of such innovation, born of a desire to mitigate suffering but destined to amplify it? Share your thoughts below. And for more glimpses into the forgotten archives of history, where every file holds a secret, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Hidden Files.